When professional bike racer Estaban was training in the forest, he ended up being chased down by a giant brown bear and eventually fell off his bike, but the bear did not attack him. In fact, it just waited for him to regain consciousness again. Something was going on with this animal, and Estaban would soon find out it needed help, but he could barely believe it when he found out with what. Estaban now felt confident enough that the bear was not going to attack him to slowly approach the animal. But this did not mean that his heart was not still beating out of his chest. As he got closer to the creature, he could see that something was up with it, judging by its strange demeanor. It needed his help, but with what? And how would he ever be able to assist an animal like this? But then Estaban saw it, and his eyes went wide. Suddenly it made complete sense why this bear had been chasing him. He knew he needed to act quick. But why had the bear been chasing Estaban? Why did it refrain from attacking him? And what did the creature apparently need help with? But before we start our story, smash the like button, make sure to subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you won't miss any new stories. To train for competition, Estaban often took his racing bike out for all-day biking sessions, for which he would often choose the highway crossing through the endless forest of Alaska, as there was very little traffic here. Of course, he was aware of the potential dangers in these forests, but he always figured that if he ever encountered anything, he would simply be too fast on his racing bike. And so far, this had actually been going quite well for Estaban. But today, everything would be different when Estaban was confronted with a treat he wanted to avoid at all costs. Near the end of an 8-hour bike ride, Estaban was heading back home and he was completely exhausted. It was supposed to be the last hard training session before the competition started again. But Estaban was not prepared at all for what was in store for him. Rising from the thick brush was the figure of a massive animal, which trotted in his direction on all fours. Estaban swerved his bike to the left, making out the animal's true form. It was a huge brown bear, and he had almost collided with it head-on. As he got his bearings, he took a look behind him and noticed the bear was still there, lurking toward him menacingly. Soon, its gait turned into a full sprint, and it was bounding toward another potential collision with Estaban. Estaban felt frozen in fear, but he knew he had to act quickly before he became the victim of a vicious attack. Estaban let out a blood-curdling scream and mounted his bike, speeding as fast as he could from the vicinity of the bear. Adrenaline was coursing through his veins as he pedaled for his life, feeling the bear creeping up on him no matter how fast he went. He knew he would only be able to bike just a little further as his legs were getting tired and he was beginning to feel as if he would pass out. His mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan. It was difficult to focus when all he could think about was the possibility that his life might soon come to an end. Left with no other options, Estaban decided to make a swift decision. He took a sharp right turn, which descended him into a part of the woods that was lined with untamed bushes and trees. It was hard for him to navigate the terrain, but it seemed to be slowing the bear down some. Estaban pedaled forward, dodging the low-hanging branches and pacing each breath so as to not totally black out from exhaustion. Just as he was beginning to feel confident in his escape, the front wheel of his bike hit a vicious bump in the road. Estaban tumbled forward, his bike collapsing underneath him. The fall was painful and it knocked the wind out of him. As he coughed and tried to regain his balance, he was met with an overwhelming fear of what was to come. The bear was only a few yards away, and it wouldn't be long now before he was met face to face with it. The stress and anxiety made him woozy, and he sank into unconsciousness as he heard the rustling of the bear's footsteps closer than they'd ever been before. There was no real evidence as to how much time had passed while Estaban was under. He awoke in a daze, his drooping eyelids fighting the bright sunlight that beamed down on him. He couldn't believe how lucky he was to still be breathing. Very slowly he rose. As he looked around for his bike, he noticed something rather jarring. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the large brown paws of the bear next to the collapsed form of his bike. With his stomach churning in fear, he took in the whole of the bear, but what he noticed next was strange and wholly unexpected. His initial thought was that the bear would immediately attack him upon seeing him stand up, but the bear's reaction was the complete opposite. He simply sat there, eyeing the man curiously for a moment, not moving. Esteban didn't know what to think or do at that moment. As he continued to stare back at the bear, he noticed the creature was making these low sounds at him, almost a cry. Was the bear in pain? It wasn't moving, and it seemed to be avoiding rising to its feet, so Esteban could only assume its trek through the woods was just as treacherous as his own. Esteban couldn't ignore the soreness emerging in his body. He touched his ribs and winced. They were tender, as were his severely scratched-up elbows and knees. On top of that, his head was throbbing mercilessly. He knew he needed to seek medical attention quickly, but there was no way for him to make it past the bear without being inches from it. The bear continued to whimper, and Esteban started to feel bad for it. From where he was standing, he couldn't see what was ailing the bear. He knew if he were to find out, he'd have to get closer, much closer. But was it worth his safety to inspect this huge wild animal? Testing the waters, he began to retreat a little. The bear rose and stood on all fours, inching forward. It didn't seem frightened by Esteban at all, and on an even stranger note, it looked nowhere near as malicious as it did during their original encounter. Feeling bold, Esteban stepped forward, gauging what sort of reaction the bear would have to being approached. It stood still, waiting for Esteban to make the next move, never averting its gaze from his eyes. Esteban continued to move forward very slowly, avoiding any stick or that could prompt the bear into an attack. After a few steps, the man and creature were almost touching. Esteban's heart leapt into his throat. Muttering a quick prayer, Esteban reached out and rested his hand on top of the bear's head, feeling its coarse fur part between his fingertips. Miraculously, the bear responded positively to this, leaning into his touch and closing its eyes. It lowered its body to the ground, appearing grateful for the gentle touch. None of this was making sense to Esteban. Bears did not necessarily want to hurt human beings. He knew this well. But they also were not known to be the friendliest of animals to encounter in the woods. He knew the bear must be in desperate need of help, and he was the only one who could assist it. As the bear continued to rest at his feet, he took the opportunity to step away and inspect the state of his bike. There was no way he would be able to ride it anywhere to retrieve help, but at least he could do one thing. He had a bottle of water attached to the bike, and thankfully, it was still there, even after the crash. He brought it over to the bear, hoping some cool water would benefit it some. He poured the water in front of the bear, and it reached out to swat at the stream a little. Esteban took this as a friendly sign and relaxed a little. The bear stretched its head forward and began licking at the water thirstily. Esteban could tell this was providing him with some relief. However, he was still in the dark as to what had injured it in the first place. They were deep in the forest, and though Esteban did have his phone with him, he wasn't sure if he would have cell phone service all the way out here. Maybe he could call the wildlife rescue line and get some professional help for the bear. He dug through the pockets of his pants and retrieved his phone, which suffered a few cracks from the fall. Thankfully, it was still in working condition. The only issue was the battery. It had under 10% of its life left, and Esteban worried it would die before he could get any real help. Nonetheless, he took the opportunity to dial for assistance. The service around the area was spotty, but Esteban was grateful there was any at all. The bear let out a small groan at his feet again, and Esteban looked down. This time, he was able to see what afflicted the bear so terribly. One of the bear's paws had something lodged in it, and it was making the area profusely bleed. Esteban let out a gasp and tried to take a closer look, but the bear was apprehensive, choosing instead to nurse the paw himself and shield it from Esteban. Now he understood why the bear had been chasing after him. It wasn't allowed in the area, but people were known to come to these parts of the woods and hunt the local wildlife. The bear must have been shot by some arrogant hunter and thought Esteban was the culprit. Luckily, Esteban was able to get in contact with the park ranger's office and notify them of what was happening. Eventually, people managed to make it to Esteban and checked out the bear. It turned out that it was very sick and needed help, which a local vet was able to provide it. The animal made a full recovery, and even though Esteban had to miss his next races, he was quickly back to top condition and racing on a new bike.